You're listening to the I Love You Keep Going podcast with George Haas. For more information, please visit our website at www.mettagroup.org. That's www.mettagroup.org.
So welcome, everybody. This is I Love You Keep Going. It is January 12th, 2023. It's 7:38 p.m. Pacific time. And before the recording started, we were talking about self-generated emotion and regulating emotion and cognitive function. But I wanted to talk about something else tonight. So I think I'm going to change the topic. Mary Main died. I don't know if you know who Mary Main is. She died on the 6th, so a few days ago. And because this is an attachment focused group, I wanted to honor her by talking about her a little bit. She was one of the seminal minds in the development of attachment theory. And her discovery of disorganized attachment was, and I think will be, one of the most significant contributions to psychology as we know it, and also incredibly helpful to people in terms of understanding why it is that their lives are difficult in a way that really nothing else had before that managed. So I'm creating a fairly high bar and talking about what she was able to do. And she did this first with Mary Ainsworth, who, as you may recall, in the attachment world was associated with John Bowlby, the originator of the theory, and she, Mary Main's husband, Eric Hesse, who was involved in all of this. They worked out of UC at Berkeley. The other thing that she did, which was so significant, was she was part of the group that developed the adult attachment interview, which is the assessment tool that allows us to determine what your attachment conditioning is. I think it's very exciting that we live in a time where these kinds of discoveries are being made, because when you couple that with the efforts of Dan Brown and his group to develop strategies that actually can repair attachment, the discovery of what it is that's wrong, and also the discovery of what you can do to repair it is remarkable. My grandmother, who died at 95, and I would guess in maybe 89 or 90, something like that, used to say when we were growing up that you need to pick somebody who comes from a good family, because it doesn't matter how much you love a person. If they don't come from a good family, they really won't be able to support you in the relationship. They really won't be able to support a family. And I think that that was the wisdom of understanding that there are certain things that happen to people in their early lives that there is no way to undo until this period. So it's going to be interesting to see. I was talking to Mary about this, I don't know how long ago, maybe 8 years ago or something. And she said that because there was no reliable way to repair adverse attachment conditioning, that she preferred to think about it in terms of what we could develop and offer parents so that they could parent their children in a way that the children would be secure. And I do think that that's a wonderful approach if we could intervene in such a way that children, all children, really developed in a secure way. The way that they would be able to function as adults would be quite different than what we see in the world now. That takes a lot of resources. We don't obviously live in a society where that seems to be a priority. Um, but I think also that she was making that uh, expression because there wasn't something that could reliably affect attachment conditioning and move it toward earned security. But these are marvelous contributions, and it's interesting to really understand that in our very complex society with the values the way that they are, there are people doing this fundamental work that actually is going to be so useful to all of us. John Bowlby uh, came of age between the First and Second World War, uh, the war to end all wars, and the next war after the war to end all wars. The psychoanalytic community had moved from being centered in Vienna to being centered in London because there was so much pressure on the Jewish communities in that period between wars. And so they fled. And so he grew up in that environment where the idea that what actually happened to you caused these things was secondary to actually your interpretation of them. Partly this is because Freud backed down about that, his famous 1894 paper, because he was getting so much pressure from saying that adverse childhood experiences caused psychological problems. The parent group did not want to hear that, and so they pressured him into withdrawing that idea. One of the things that Bowlby thought was that actually it was those conditions that caused the difficulties in adult lives, adverse childhood conditions. And he was interested in examining that. During the Second World War, when Germany bombed London, with the idea that they would break the morale of the British people so that they would surrender by bombing civilian targets. The government responded by removing children from the East End of London and putting them into foster care in the countryside. That was a common practice at the time, particularly in poor families. Children were removed and placed in public orphanages ordinarily when a new baby came into the household, so that the mother could bond with the new baby. And then after 6 weeks, the other children in the home were brought back into the home. And, after the Second World War, Bowlby was tasked by the British government to evaluate whether the children being separated from their caregivers and placed in foster care in the countryside would cause harm to the children that then the government would have to provide services for. In the end, in evaluating that, discovered that yes, it's likely that there's lifelong harm caused by that separation, and then uh, the practice of separating children ordinarily from their families with the entry of a new infant in the families was ended because it was part of this recognition. Bowlby wanted, because he was a psychiatrist, to have empirical data about the nature of these things and also to understand what was happening. And so he hired a researcher. He put an ad in the paper. Mary Ainsworth was an American. Her husband was a diplomat, and she was in London, and she answered the ad. And in collaboration with Bowlby, created the strange situation. The strange situation is a way of evaluating children to see what their attachment response is. And as young as 10 months old, they're taken into this strange situation for evaluation, which is a room with some chairs, a small room filled with toys. And they watch the interaction of child and parent at 8 points in this. A stranger enters, a stranger leaves, the caregiver uh, leaves the child, and they watch how the child reacts. And Bowlby began to recognize these three patterns: a secure pattern, an anxious avoidant pattern, and an anxious ambivalent pattern. But he wanted to understand the nature of that, and so Ainsworth and her team of researchers went into the homes of the people that he investigated and began to watch the patterns of that, and so documented the different kinds of behaviors that parents do with their children that then produces these outcomes. And then her husband moved, and she repeated that in Africa, and then she returned to the US, continuing her collaboration with Bowlby at a distance, ended up at Johns Hopkins. It's a sometimes it's hard to imagine where we are now in terms of the progress that we made, what that must have been like for a woman to attempt to go into a research university that was so male dominated and um, uh, seek a place of equal standing in that environment. Mary Main said, imagine this. Uh, Mary Ainsworth is on the faculty of Johns Hopkins, but the faculty club does not allow women in the building. Um, so Ainsworth's approach to this was to get dressed up looking pretty nice, walk past the maitre d' and sit herself down at a table in the faculty club. And the faculty club's response to this was simply to ignore her, that had happened. So she went on a Monday and they ignored her. She stayed for the whole lunch and then she got up and left. And then she came on Tuesday. They ignored her. And they ignored her on Wednesday and Thursday. And on Friday, as the waiter was walking by, she asked him for a glass of water, and he brought her a glass of water. And so the precedent of a woman being served in the faculty club was broken by that gesture. So politeness wins out in the end. But then you have Mary Main, who is looking for a doctorate, a PhD program in linguistics, applying to different academic programs and being turned down all across the country in that particular field, one year and then another. And her advisor saying, listen, what you need to do is apply to women who have the ability to bring in PhD students, because that's the only way that you're going to get in. And it doesn't matter what the curriculum is. once you get in, you'll have more maneuverability. Mary Main wanted to study linguistics, but she applied around, and the only person that was interested in her was Mary Ainsworth. So she went, and she joined the program. They did the strange situation and the analysis of the strange situation. So this is a film or a videotape of the uh, the interactions between parent and child and researcher. Um, there was a clear presentation of a secure child, a clear presentation of an anxious avoidant child, a clear presentation of an anxious ambivalent child. The secure child seeks proximity to their caregiver. They look to their caregiver for assurance that the environment is safe. And once they have the assurance that the environment is safe, they begin to explore. If they feel threatened, they retreat and seek protection from the caregiver. They settle pretty easily. An avoidant child doesn't seek proximity to the caregiver. They seem to operate independently without that need for attention or reassurance. And an anxious, ambivalent child is clingy and finds it very hard to settle, very hard to explore, and those patterns were quite clear. There was a group of kids, though, that they couldn't pattern, didn't fit into either one of those, and they set those aside. One of the things that they were interested in understanding is, did the attachment strategy of the caregiver influence the attachment strategy of the child? And so Mary Main and her group began to devise different ways of trying to test the attachment strategy of the caregiver that would be predictive of what the attachment strategy of the child became. Does that make sense? So they're evaluating in the exploring the attachment strategy of the caregiver to see if it had a predictive nature to the attachment strategy of the child. And they devised the adult attachment interview. I think Mary said that one of her graduate students did most of it. And then they began to test it. And what they found was that the AAI is 85% predictive of what your child's attachment strategy was. And they began to research it in different ways. In fact, the attachment strategy is handed down generation to generation. You have a 70% chance, for instance, of having the same attachment strategy as your great grandmother. So that's 4 generations of transmission of the same attachment strategy. So we really do learn from our caregivers in the way that they relate to us, the nature of attachment. At some point, they decided that they would look at the attachment, the strange situation interviews that did not fall into those 3 categories. And that's through that investigation discovered the disorganized category, which is, I think, one of these phenomenal breakthroughs. Probably don't know it at the moment, but it turns into that. So for the work that we do here at Mettagroup, so much of her contribution is things that we use with the students here to evaluate and help repair attachment. And so I just wanted to mark her passing. Such a lovely person who really had this eye out for helping all of us, which is, I think, remarkable. It's also interesting when you think about this through the Buddhist lens about the nature of karma. her interest in linguistics was actually the thing that cracked the code. But in the beginning, it looked like she was going to have to abandon her interest in linguistics and go with the limitations that uh, the national and local cultures imposed. Dan used to say that if you live an ethical life, the things that happen can be viewed as good karma. But often what happens is they're not what you want. And we have a tendency to orient our understanding around the nature of karma as in terms of getting what we want or not getting what we want. And that the interesting aspect of exploring the experience that you're having is that if you live this ethical life, the things that happen are the good karma. And how then do you begin to understand that? So that you're not rejecting what's happening, you're really pulling in what's happening and being present for what's happening. I think that her story is a marvelous illustration of that. Christian?
Was Mary Main tracking or corresponding with Dan Brown through like the Three Pillars development?
Well, I my recollection of talking to the two of them is that they had not met more than for a cursory introduction at a conference, and that um, Mary Main was on the research side, and she actually asked people not to use the research on the clinical side until they were actually sure about it. And so they did not correspond in that way. The research side and the clinical side are quite different in terms of the motivation for things. The research side is just looking at what it is and what's happening, and the clinical side is looking for things that might be effective in changing it and creating a particular outcome. So you move through a lot of iterations of what might or might not work. I think that Dan said that his group had spent 20 years developing the method that they did that eventually worked. Carol?
Yeah, I noted that Mary Ainsworth died about 1999. Did Mary Mains stay active all these 22 years since?
Mary Main and Mary Ainsworth were great friends and stayed in contact the whole time, as I understand.
But I was wondering about, was she active in the last 20 years since Ainsworth died in 1999?
Mary Main, you mean?
Yes. Mhm.
Yeah, she's been working at Berkeley, continuing the research since then,
Wow.
the whole time. Jake?
At any point in her life, did she decide that, okay, this is enough solid research and then we can, it can be applied to clinical practice? Was she ever involved in that, or was she just purely doing research until the end of her life?
She just did the research. It wasn't her area. She was fascinated by it, though. We did talk about it quite a bit.
Can you add something, since you gave us all her story? Can you tell us about your story with her?
Well, really, it was I met her doing the Adult Attachment Institute, which I did a couple of times, and then I saw her at a conference. So, but during the institute, you have lunch, and I had quite a few lunches with her in the faculty club at Berkeley. So, and asking these kinds of questions, have you not thought of doing clinical practice? No, it's not my thing. I'm just interested in the research and actually uh, um, thinking that the resources would be better spent on developing interventions for families while children are young so that they can develop secure attachment, which I think is happening. If you could go in to a family and teach the caregivers just around the attachment question what they need to do, it is easier than, say, undoing a lifetime of poor attachment conditioning. I quite liked her, and I quite liked Eric, her husband, and their primary research colleague, Naomi is her name.
Were you able to share with Mary the kind of work that you've been doing, this synthesis of meditation and attachment theory?
Yes, I was, and we talked about it quite a bit. She marveled at it in a sense, and was delighted that there was something that could be done. When but also to understand the nature of her mind and the openness of it and support, she allowed me to go to the Institute twice as a meditation teacher, not as a psychology professional. I knew that it was going to be hard to get into the Institute initially, and so I spent a few days writing what I thought was a great cover letter, which I sent and got no reply. So then I rewrote the letter and sent it to a different group that was also offering the training. And they wrote me back and said that they would be happy to accept me to the Institute, but why wouldn't I just go to the Institute in California instead of traveling halfway across the country? And I said, because they wouldn't let me in. And they said, tell you what, we'll forward your letter to them and say that we've talked to you and we think that you're sincere. And so then I heard back from them that they would be willing to let me in. Now, some of you may remember, but I had this full beard down to my belly and this long hair when I went up there. And so I was quite different than in the first institute. One half of the room were basically psychiatrists, and the other half of the room were basically career civil servants working in public mental health. One of the things about the assessment is that it's very time and skill intensive. You have to train to be able to do it. And so it isn't, at least in our culture, the way that we operate now, something that is going to be available, because it's too hard for our culture. And then the level of skill that you have to develop in order to be able to do it, give the interview and score it yourself is really high. It's a high bar, and so it's a kind of training that isn't a couple of weekends, and it's also way more effective. And then in the second institute, it was more oriented toward psychology people in practice, private practice, who were thinking that this would be a good thing. But I think that that's also the time we're in. It takes a long time for these ideas to permeate into culture, really 30 to 40 years for a discovery that actually tests well and holds up to become widely understood in a culture. and then the process of trying to create some way of utilizing it in the culture it takes longer than that. So we're just really at the beginning of this process of understanding the effects of attachment conditioning and then how to unwind it. So it'll be interesting to see how that unfolds. I know that from our approach, which is a meditation approach, not a psychotherapy approach, we use the ideal parent figure to remap that. But that was always a meditation approach from the Tibetan Bon practice of Mahamudra. We don't do the mentalization-based training in a therapeutic, psychotherapeutic frame. We do it as a meditation practice using a metta-vipassana structure. And then we don't do the psychoeducation using the therapeutic bond between therapist and client. We do it in a class structure. So we do a psychoeducation that's a group setting for where we offer the information. It took a while to convince Dan Brown that this was going to be a usable approach, but when he we worked on a study together, when he saw the outcomes of the study, he recognized that it was a useful approach, which was gratifying. So she was 80 when she died, which is a good long life, well spent. And I'm so appreciative of that effort and the serendipity of karma. So it is, the thing actually that I really liked about her is that she was game. Do you know what I mean by that? She was up for it. She was up for life. She was up for what was happening. Well, let's do a little practice. What do you think?
I had a one quick question. I mean, to me, George, your synthesis of these techniques is cutting edge and obviously very effective, and people have been noticing that. Are there other people who have figured this out in the similar way?
Well, I don't know that there's another meditation group that does it the way that we do. There is Dan's group that does the three-pillar approach as a psychotherapy-based thing, and there are different groups that do different aspects of it that it isn't all together. For instance, the Anthony Bateman, Peter Fonagy group out of Tavistock in London, part of the Anna Freud Center, has MBT, which works in terms of reducing the symptoms of different kinds of personality disorders. But I don't know that it earns people security using the AAI as the metric for that. Beyond the dance group, I don't know of another group that does. But I think that that's because where we are in terms of the timeline of this entering into our culture. I don't know that while these approaches work and they're effective, and that other approaches won't come along. I don't know. what will happen, really. I do wish that we would, as a society, begin to address these conditions. One of the things that's, I don't know if you're aware of this, but addiction is we think of addiction as an attachment disturbance. And certainly the legal approach to addressing this is of no value, and it's very expensive. You know, what other program that was a complete failure would you fund year after year after year if it wasn't making everybody so much money who's providing the services that don't work?
Are you talking about 12 steps?
12 steps, no, I'm talking more about the criminal justice system and the making the drugs illegal, all of that, all of those consequences. I mean, there's there's law enforcement, there's the prison system, there's the judicial system, there's the medical system. The 12-step world is really useful, but it also is not hugely effective. But one of the things that's happened with the illegality of all of this is that it's pushed the manufacturers of illicit drugs into producing substances which are fundamentally harming. So the P2P meth, the fentanyl, and now they call it, I think TARP, but it's a tranquilizer for livestock, which is now being mixed in with fentanyl and anyway, it causes terrible damage to the body, so that we have super addictive drugs that cause permanent harm to the people that use them, and because of this legal wedge that we use to push them into a place where they have no options, it's just a catastrophe that is unfolding now. Anyway, I'll stop. It upsets me that we can't just recognize that these are people that need treatment, not incarceration. And that if we can begin to look at this as through the attachment lens, we might be able to help. Christian?
George, in terms of other modalities, hopefully I'm not misremembering, but I believe transference-focused psychotherapy has had some good outcomes in terms of shifting attachment, but I think it's a pretty long-term approach.
Right. Well, they did have some studies that showed that 10 years of psychotherapy with the same psychotherapist, if there was a good therapeutic relationship, could shift attachment. In our society, considering that 70% of the population could use some attachment work, what do you think the likelihood is that we're going to provide 10 years of psychotherapy to everybody? I would put the chances at 0. Cindy?
What about the use of ayahuasca and some of the other so-called more natural mind-altering substances, that are used in the shamanistic world? Have those proven to be helpful in any arena that you're involved in?
I don't know. I think that for people that have a very rigid sense of self and very hard reality, that they're very useful in prying that open. But I don't know. It's certainly very uh, popular now.
Yeah.
So I don't know. The partly we have to wait and see what the long-term effect is, and partly we have to study it in a way that we can actually get some information about it. I don't know. You know, long-term meditator thinks that meditation is will provide all of the insights that you can get from psychedelics, and that it's more stable. But if you could take a pill and be instantly enlightenment, would you take it? That's the question.
Well, sometimes it's a portal or a window to
Yeah.
what's possible, what our capacity may hold. And
Yeah.
I do find reports, I haven't had it myself, but reports of people who've experienced that have gone on the path of meditation because they had an enlightening experience. Yeah.
Yeah. That would be I think a super useful outcome.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so too.
All right. Loving kindness. How's that?
That was good.
Good. I have to admit, Jennifer, that while I was sitting, images of the cake that you brought over kept floating in my mind.
Well, it's kind of nice that the cake was that memorable.
Anything else you wanted to say?
I felt like there was that the concentration was building and then it would fade and then it would come back and then it would fade and it felt like it was kind of building.
Nice.
Um, and my body got really hot and then there were sensations of kind of shiv, you know, the what's that word? Kind of shivery
Uh-huh.
feelings. Um, yeah, so that's what happened.
Good.
I can share.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I seem to be and you can of course give me some suggestions on this, but I seem to be resonating with imagining a person who I feel loving kindness with. And by the way, there's been a couple incidences where I felt it during the week and I'm like, oh, that must be it. So it just yeah, it just generates a warm feeling in my heart energy. And just so I was able to access that with two different people during the practice. And I wondered what to do with it after that. Of course, I get distracted and I go off on narratives. So then
Right.
I coming back and saying, "Oh yeah, remember?" And one of them was, Rick Hansen, the neurodharma guy. So he gave a talk last night, and his look of loving kindness when he just sits there, he's so kind of quirky, but there's something about his look that is just so endearing
Uh-huh.
and makes my heart open. And since it was last night, I had that feeling at the end of his talk as he just stares into the camera with all this juicy loving kindness. So I was able to access that. And then I wondered, what do you mean by the right view? Like, am I on the right track to just sort of feel it
So
and going back to it? Yeah.
when you notice how does conceptual reality look to you? Does it look differently?
Conceptual reality versus what?
So when you have the mindset of loving kindness, how does everything appear? And when you don't have the mindset of loving kindness, how does it appear? And can you see the difference in the way that self and world appear?
Well, I have to, figure out what you mean by conceptual, because for me, it's just a feeling energy and maybe a little bit of visualization. Yeah.
Right. So the ultimate reality experience is the pure sensing, and then we make it into solid self, solid world. But when we make it into solid self, solid world, the mind state or view that we're holding affects the way things appear. And so what we're trying to track is the differences in the way things appear to us depending on what mind state we're holding, or whether the mind is equanimous in the moment.
Mm-hmm.
But I would also say you're making progress in this because you're able to identify the state in the body. Now we just need
Have
you
a
to,
feeling tone in response to pulling up, I don't know if you call it this conceptual thought of this person who I had the feeling with last night. Yeah.
right. So now the idea is to explore, how does self and world appear to you when you're in that state?
It feels great. It's light and buoyant and beautiful and all
Well,
that.
then when you're not in that state, how does the world look?
Kind of mixed, kind of like whatever comes along and rolls, rocks my boat the wrong way or the right way or
So
whatever.
then you're beginning to understand the differences in view. One view is a sort of neutral, maybe. The other view has this liveliness to it.
Right.
So good.
Progress.
Yes.
All right. Thank you.
Perfection is too hard, so we're not going for
No,
that.
that was the aim here. Waiting for perfection or
Good.
hit the target. Yeah.
Someone else?
Yeah. When you ask that question of how does the conceptual reality of self and world seem when you're in that state, mind state, and just what hadn't thought about it, but as you asked the question, what came up for me is that there was a real lack of opposition, or there was no tension or no
Right.
opposing forces. It just was very as is, or relaxed, with a deep acceptance of that.
Good.
Yeah.
Open, I would call that.
Open. Okay.
Wonderful.
Yeah. So, but it's like, oh, I don't feel like anything's opposing me.
Yeah.
That's nice.
Indeed.
Hmm,
Good.
thanks.
Stacy?
Hi, George. So I'm kind of embarrassed to admit this, but I'm going to anyway. I I don't really have an easy person. I think I must have like only complicated relationships, and like I sometimes can find like my friend's baby or.
Right.
But what about could I use like the moonrise, or
Well,
could I not use a person?
so are you able to identify loving kindness?
Yeah.
So if you don't have an easy person, what that means is you're going to have to use somebody who's not easy, but that you do hold the mindset of loving kindness for. And you just have to push all of the other mind states that you have associated with that person out of the way and focus on the loving kindness aspect.
Okay.
The
Okay.
reason we say
That's
easy, the reason Sayadaw was teaching easy, and if you had somebody where that was the only mindset associated, then when you thought of them, that mindset would just come up because that's the only one you have. But not everybody has an easy person, and you know, it's really just about learning to identify the mind state, then moving on to being able to zoom in on that mind state in association with the more complex pattern of people that you know better.
okay. Yep. I can do that. Thanks so much.
Good. And then hopefully that becomes easy for everybody, and then everybody becomes an easy person. Someone else?
Is the aim to drop the phrase, may I be peaceful or may you be peaceful? And drop that completely and just go into the feeling or view or
Well, there's a few reasons for the phrase. Mainly it's to fill up auditory thinking so auditory thoughts don't distract you. But also, if you do get into a high concentration state, for instance, the first metta jhana it's unstable and you pop out. But it's easy to be disoriented and not really know what you're doing when you pop out of that level of concentration. Then you hear the phrase and it reminds you what you're doing so you can come back faster. It's quite easy to get altered when you get into high concentration states. And then you'll pop out and it'll just be sort of blissful. And so you just hang out in the blissful state.
and then you come back. You use the phrase again when you pop out or what?
Well, you pop out and you're a little disoriented, a little blissful, and then you hear the phrase and you think, oh yeah, I'm doing metta. I'll come back and reset. Because if you don't have the phrase and you pop out, you could literally sit there for 20 minutes, space out.
I see. That's helpful.
It doesn't happen. So these periods are pretty short, but when we used to do this against the stream, we would sit for 50 minutes or an hour, and it was very ordinary for people to get quite blitzed out by it. And then for 20 minutes afterwards, everybody's sort of bumping into each other because they're altered. All right. Thank you for being here and listening to me rattle on about Mary Main, who I just adored and feel quite sad about. We are doing a level 1 on Saturdays. So last week was the first one. There's 3 more of those. It's from 9 until 1:15. I'm co-teaching with Stas Fedichin. We're going to be talking about emotional regulation and then describing secure attachment, I think. And then that's on Saturday. We have a level 2 class starting in February. Take a look at that if you're interested in that. What else? We still have the retreat set up in Utrecht in June. So anyway, it's all on the website. I offer this class freely, but I do hope that you'll consider making a donation. There's a link on the website to do that. The donation helps support me and also the work that Mettagroup is doing. Really appreciate your practice. I hope to see you soon, and have a good night. Bye.
Thank you, George.
Thank you, George. Good night.
Good night.
Happy New Year, George.
Thanks. Bye.